So we want to think about what contributes to biodiversity. What makes a place have more biodiversity than another place? So there's these different things all contribute to that. So climate, the history of the area, the size of the habitat, how isolated the habitat is, and habitat heterogeneity, which I will describe what that is here in a little bit. So climate. What kinds of climates do you think would promote biodiversity? So you're probably thinking about what makes a rainforest unique, since rainforests are so biodiverse. And so places that are warmer, places that have more water tend to have more species. So we can see here exactly that. Temperature, higher temperatures tend to be more diverse. Elevation, lower elevations, which are also tend to be warmer, have higher diversity. Solar radiation, areas with more solar radiation, which is related, of course, to temperature. And then areas with more precipitation tend to have more diversity. And these conditions tend to occur near the equator, so the tropics, exactly what we see with patterns of biodiversity. Part of this has to do with primary productivity. And so this is the rate of biomass production by our primary producers, by autotrophs. And it's an indication of the rate of solar energy conversion to chemical energy. Chemical energy just meaning sugar. So when plants turn energy from the sun into sugars. Net primary productivity is the energy left after respiration. And we see that the highest levels of productivity occur in tropical forests, coral reefs, and estuaries, and thus they can support more species and more biomass of organisms. This shows different levels of ecosystem productivity, and so we can see tropical rainforests and estuaries and coral reefs are by far the highest. Intensive agriculture is also pretty high, and that's because we, as people, engineer it to be as productive as possible. Then we get more temperate forests, coniferous forests, and then lower are coastal zones and grassland shrublands, and then really low tends to be the desert and open ocean. History is also important, and I know that probably sounds kind of weird, but the history of a place. So if it's been occupied longer, it tends to have more species. So things like newly created islands from volcanoes are going to have fewer species because they haven't been around as long as islands that have been around for a very long time. And so we can look at this because it has a lot to do with evolution. So the longer an area has been there, we get longer time for speciation. And that was part of why we think that the ocean environment has a whole lot of species, because the ocean environment is the ecosystem that's been around and had species for the longest. So it's had longer times for new species to occur. And that's called speciation, the process of the creation of new species. So this graph kind of shows this. It looks at the how old the different species are. I know this terminology is probably a little confusing, but areas that have been around the longest are over on this end of the axis. And then species richness. I want you to think back. What is species richness? Hopefully you remembered that it's the number of species. Just if you counted up all the species, that's what species richness is. So you get more species when an area has been around longer, so more evolutionary history. And you can see this relationship here. Habitat size is another important variable. So what do you think? Do larger or smaller habitats have more species? What's your prediction? So you probably predicted this, and it's pretty intuitive. Bigger areas have more species. And this is called the species area relationship, and it's probably the most well-supported relationship in ecology. Pretty much if you look at any kind of ecosystems, larger ones of that tend to have more species. So here's some examples. We have Number of bird species on Caribbean islands of different sizes, and you can see there's this positive relationship where bigger islands have more bird species. If you look over here, we get the number of beetle species on islands in a Swedish lake. Bigger islands, more species of beetles. We can even think about sizes of mountains, where bigger mountains have more species of mammals. And then we can look at the size of lakes and the number of fish species, and larger lakes tend to have more species of fish. So this is supported over and over and over again. How about isolation? So we have two islands here. One is closer to the mainland than the other. Which one do you think would have more species? Basically, we see that when islands are farther away, they tend to have fewer species. And so if the habitat is more isolated, it'll have fewer species. And the idea here is that it's harder for some species to get to the farther area. So the things that can travel short distances are all going to be at the closer island. Also get all the species that can travel a long distance. But at the farther island, you're only going to get species that can travel the farther distances and not any of the ones that can only go a short way. And we see this supported by data as well. So this shows the number of mammal species and mountains that are different distances away. And you can see the ones that are the farthest have the fewest mammal species. The next concept is habitat heterogeneity, and this just means different kinds of habitats inside the area. So the number and distribution of different habitats. And so what do you think? If we have more different kinds of habitats in an area, are you going to get more species or less species? The answer is more. So as we increase the variety of different habitats, we get more species because there's more different areas and different resources available for those different species. And so this is supported with data as well. And so we can see butterfly species richness and number of different land cover classes. And so that's an index of habitat heterogeneity. And we get the diversity of foliage height. And so as there are more different heights of plants, we get more species of birds. And diversity of plants relates to diversity of insects. So what contributes to biodiversity? We get climate, history, habitat size, habitat isolation, and habitat heterogeneity. All of these interact to determine the biodiversity in a particular area. And so we kind of have to think about all of them if we're trying to understand why one area has more species than another.